All right, so today's webinar topic is CSS inlining in email, what it is and how to do it. And I'm really excited to talk about this. I think there's a lot of myths around CSS inlining in email, and it's just one of those topics that we definitely need to talk about more in the email industry and provide more education around it. So just real quick introduction. I am Kevin Mandeville. You can follow me on Twitter at Kevin Mandeville if you like email geekery stuff. I tweet about all things email design and development, so follow me there if that's what you like to get in your Twitter feed. But part of my role here at Litmus, I actually design and build emails at Litmus. So if you subscribe to any of our Litmus emails, I've probably been involved in the development of those emails at some point in time. So I know a lot about CSS inlining because I've done a lot, I've tried a lot, and I'm excited to share what I've learned about it so far. So again, you can tweet at Litmus app on Twitter or use the hashtag Litmus Live. Any questions you have, we'll try to respond to them there on Twitter. And Lauren's going to be taking in all the questions, and I'll be answering them at the end of the webinar today. So I want to start off going over some of the bare basics, elementary stuff. I know this might be boring for some of you, but I just want to sort of start at the beginning so that everybody has a clear understanding of what we're talking about. So first of all, what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's a style sheet language used for describing the presentation of a document written in a markup language. So that's the official definition of CSS, and it's one of three core facets that we use to build for the web and email. But for the web, there's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML defines the structure of the content that you use in a web page or an email. So these are div tags, heading tags, paragraph tags. If you want to incorporate images or tables or whatever it might be, you define all of that in the HTML. That's the content of this component. And then for CSS, we get to control the style. So you can control the width of items, the font size of text, the display of tables or divs. You control all the styling of the content with CSS. And then finally, JavaScript controls the interaction. So if you're doing things like triggering modals on a button click or something like that, all of that's controlled through JavaScript. Now, some crazy email developers like Mark Robbins have figured out how to recreate basically interaction using just CSS. But for all intents and purposes, JavaScript is what's used and should be used for interaction on the web. We're not going to talk any more about that really today because it's email and you can't use JavaScript. But that's just sort of those are the three core tenets. And the analogy I like to use when explaining this to everybody is it's like a house. So HTML is the actual foundation of what's contained in a house. So you can determine the number of floors, rooms, doors, if you have a television, whatever the objects are or the content, you can define that in the HTML. And the CSS is the styling of those actual items. It's really the interior design. So you can determine the dimensions of a room, the color on the walls, the placement of the furniture, anything like that. Anything to do with the actual styling, the interior design, that's what the CSS would control. And then finally, JavaScript would be the interaction you have with the house. So ringing the doorbell, turning on or off lights, etc., things of those nature. Any interaction you would have, JavaScript would control that. So I like using that analogy, and it's a really easy way to explain it to people who might not know what you're talking about. So we're going to jump into the three different ways to use CSS and explore these. So the three different ways that you can use CSS are external style sheets, embedded CSS, and inline CSS. I'm going to go through each of these briefly to explore each method. The first of which is external style sheets. So external style sheets is a way to host a style sheet, a CSS file, separately from the HTML files. And you can reference that CSS file in each of the HTML files so that the CSS file essentially acts as this external, globally applicable CSS styles. And anytime you need to make a change or update, it then gets applied to every single HTML file where that's referenced. And this is very helpful when you're dealing on the web. If you can imagine having hundreds or even thousands of web pages on a given site or app, it would be impossible to have to manually update every single HTML file. So this is a way to sort of store your CSS separately, and it creates a more maintainable approach to your CSS. Here's what an external style sheet would look like in your code. In the head of your HTML file, you would essentially have a link tag, and that link tag would then reference that CSS file. So anytime you see a link tag like this in the head, it's using a rel of style sheet, a type of text/CSS, and it's pointing to an href of an actual CSS file of .css. This is an external style sheet implementation. The second approach is embedded CSS. This CSS is being embedded in the actual HTML file where it's being used. This is not going to be able to be globally applied to more than one HTML file. It strictly lives in the HTML file where it's used. And this is used and implemented with a style tag. So inside the head of the document, it will essentially have its own style block in the file where you can then input and apply your CSS that you want for that individual document. And this is something that's commonly used for HTML email components for things that are not inline. And then finally, the last method and approach is inline CSS. And this is where you will take the CSS properties and inject and insert them into an HTML style attribute. So you can take all of your styling, input it into a style attribute that's being applied on individual HTML elements, and that CSS is applied to those given HTML elements. And this is what we need to use for HTML email, and we're going to talk about why next. So why inline CSS is important for HTML email, and it's the preferred method. So I want to go over and cover the support for the various CSS approaches that we just talked about. The first being external style sheet support in HTML email. So when you take a look at this, the nice thing to notice is that Apple does a great job of supporting external style sheets. So whether you're using Apple Mail on the desktop or iOS Mail, and that's any version of iOS, everything from all the way back to 6, 7, all the way now 8, 9, 10, whatever OS or whatever device you're using, iPhone or iPad, Apple has complete support for external style sheets, which is really nice. Outlook, surprisingly enough, I know we like to think of Outlook as the bane of our existence as email developers, but it actually supports external style sheets for Outlook desktop. So whether it's on Windows or Mac, any version from 2000 to 2016 actually supports style sheets. And then the native mail app on Android actually supports external style sheets as well. Where the biggest breakdown for external style sheet support comes in is when you get into the webmail clients. So any email client that's accessed in the browser, so AOL Mail, Yahoo Mail, Outlook.com, Gmail, no webmail client supports external style sheets. And this is typically because they are processing the email in some way, shape, or form, whether that's through an iframe or actually completely processing out into the DOM of the actual HTML page that it's being looked at. So, but it has pretty good support, which is encouraging. But since we're talking about universal support here, 42% of email clients do not support external style sheets, and that's a very big chunk of it, which is why we have to rule this out as sort of the go-to method or a reliable method of using CSS and HTML email. And by the way, I'm gathering this data. Every month, we capture over 1 billion email opens from our customers who use Litmus Email Analytics, and we actually publish this data every month on emailclientmarketshare.com. We show the top 10 email clients that are used every single month, and I'm basically taking all of this support in conjunction with the usage of the general market share and applying that. So this is where I'm getting these figures from, just a quick FYI on that. Next, we have embedded CSS support, which gets a bit better. And when I talk about embedded CSS, I just want to make the quick note. I'm only talking about true embedded CSS support, so including class and ID support, not factoring in element selectors. Regular Gmail supports element selectors, but for the sake of this argument, I'm talking about true CSS support here. And the support jumps up drastically. And if you take a look at it, the only family of clients that does not support embedded CSS is Gmail. So everything from the Gmail apps on Android to regular Gmail, so gmail.com, to Inbox by Gmail, or Google Apps, which uses a custom domain. So we at Litmus use Google Apps, but we have an @litmus.com, but we're still using Gmail, and that's what the Google Apps version is. So none of those clients support embedded CSS, unfortunately. And Gmail, they strip out any class or ID in the head. And this is the core reason why we need to use inline CSS and HTML emails, because of Gmail. Because when you look at Gmail's market share alone, they account for 25% of the market share. So that's a big chunk of email clients that don't even support embedded CSS, let alone external style sheets. And we can thank Gmail for that. So please tweet at Gmail asking, why don't you have nice CSS support in HTML email? It's been one of those long struggles, and it will continue to be with this email client for quite some time. But the nice thing is that when we turn to inline CSS, although it's not accessible, although it's completely tedious and there's a ton of drawbacks to it, this is where we get 100% universal support in all the email clients. It's all green check marks down the line. Everything's good to go. So 100% of email clients support inline CSS, and this is why we need to use it when we're styling our HTML emails. So I want to go over the effects of what inlining or not inlining has. And not inlining, it can have really, really small effects. So if you don't use inline, it can have a bit of variance. So if we take a look at this example here from CodePen, on the left-hand side, it's without inline CSS. On the right-hand side is with inline CSS. You can see I put a red box just around the link styling. Very, very subtle difference, but you can tell that on the left-hand side it doesn't have the same styling as it does on the right-hand side. And that's like a really, you might roll your eyes a little bit and be like, okay, I can live with that. That's not necessarily, a worst-case scenario, but it's something that can happen and you need to be aware of. But we can go from something that is very small and very little in this example, and then we can go to really, really big examples that it truly affects rendering. So here's an example of sort of a boilerplate email template that's used for testing here. And this is what it would look like without inline styling at all. It'll make you pretty angry when you start to see stuff like this in Gmail. Whereas on the right-hand side with inline CSS, you get a totally different experience with the email. So you can have two vastly different experiences based on whether you inline your CSS or not. Here's another one, and this one's even worse just because it really sort of impacts the layout a bit and it comes across really broken even without the inline CSS. The last one at least had a hierarchical order. This one leaves you really wondering, what's going on here. So you'll start to feel like this, have a few gaffes, scream a little bit, and then on the right-hand side, this is what the email looks like with styles completely inlined. And even that had some rendering issues there in Gmail, besides just the inlining part. This one is one of my favorite examples. It's sort of similar to what I just showed, but this is another sort of transactional receipt order here, but this is what it looks like in Gmail, and then this is what it looks like in Apple Mail, a really nice progressively enhanced client. And it's like this gorgeous design. I actually love the receipt design. It's pretty unique. It even has some depth to it, but it's just, it didn't even account for a fallback state for Gmail with inline styles or anything. So you don't want to have to deal with what you see on the left-hand side. You don't want to be this email in the inbox that everybody gets. You don't want to be that email, right? We want our emails to look great, render perfectly across all different email clients. So you want to make sure that you're using inline CSS. And now some of you may be asking, well, do I have to do all of this inlining by hand, manually, by myself, over and over again and go crazy? And the answer is no. Just listen to Megan Trainor. She'll tell you no. You don't need to do that. We have CSS Inlining, which can solve this problem for us. And that's what the whole purpose of today's webinar is. So what is CSS Inlining? Let's jump into it. So definition I just sort of came up with. CSS Inlining is the automated process of moving external style sheets or embedded styles in the head right in line onto its corresponding HTML elements, so the elements that are related. So let's take a look at what this example, or what an example of this might look like here. If we take a look at a piece of code, this is an example of embedded CSS, but this could also be if it was external. Here we have in our CSS in the style block, we have a class of headline, and down in the body of the document we have an h1 tag, so basically a heading with a class of headline as well. And these two are related, and so in order to get this to work in Gmail, what we want to be able to do is take all of that CSS of headline and be able to move it from being embedded to right in line. And when we use CSS inlining and automate that process, it will automatically take that CSS for us and inject it as a style HTML attribute with all of that styling. And it will remove that CSS from the head of the document and put it right in line. It automatically does that action for you. And that is essentially the essence of CSS inlining and what it's all about. We just did a survey towards the end of last year, and it was pretty interesting, the findings. It was the State of Email Production Report, 2016 State of Email Production Report. It was actually a fantastic report, just a ton of interesting and great findings. I recommend everybody check it out to see. You get to see what other email developers and what the industry at large are doing, sort of what the trends are. But this was a question around CSS inliner usage and how many people actually used an automated CSS inlining process and workflow. And the answer was quite shocking to me. It was very, very low. I mean, 73% of email designers and developers do not use CSS inlining of any kind. They're manually doing it by hand and inlining it by hand, which was a big part of why I thought today's webinar would be really helpful. And when I hear this stat and the fact that less than 30% are actually automating their workflow of some kind, it makes me scream a little bit myself and have one of these moments from Game of Thrones right here. So I want to sort of show the other side today as to why inlining could be a good idea, and to just sort of make you stop inlining by hand and stop going crazy. Listen to my boy Neil Patrick Harris. It's time to stop it and sort of evolve the workflow a little bit so that we don't repeat ourselves and do the same thing over and over and over again. So I want to go over the various tools that we have at our disposal for CSS inlining and what we can do. And there's 3 different groups that we're going to go over today. The first one is third-party inliner sites. So third-party inliner sites are essentially these sites where you can copy and paste your HTML into this third-party site and then convert your code to inline CSS. So you can take your HTML that you worked on locally in whatever editor that you worked on, basically take that HTML, copy and paste it into one of these sites, and then it will convert it for you with a click of a button. So I'll go over some of the main inliner sites out there that exist. The one that we have at Litmus, we have PutsMail. So we have a site where you can send test HTML emails to yourself. It's called PutsMail, but it also has its own CSS inliner. So you can see right here, you would essentially just copy and paste your HTML into that body HTML source code input, and then just click on the inline CSS button, and it would automatically convert it for you. So then you could copy and paste that CSS back into your editor, or into your ESP to send out. PutsMail is a popular one. MailChimp has their own CSS inliner as well. Campaign Monitor has a CSS inliner. Again, everything here, it's all just copy and paste. Zerb has a responsive email inliner as well. A lot of people like to use Zerb. And then Premailer. And the cool thing about Premailer is that you get a little bit more customization around what to do with the CSS, which is nice. So you can use Premailer as well. Looking at the pros and cons of third-party inliner sites, and I'm going to actually walk through and show you what it looks like in a little bit here. I'm going to sort of go over all these techniques first and then show them in action. We'll do like a live demo. But sort of the pros and cons of third-party inliner sites. The nice thing is that there's no learning curve or setup at all, right? You just take your code, you can copy and paste it into one of those sites, and away you go. You can use it with any editor, so whatever you're familiar with, you don't have to do anything to get your workflow set up. And there's no maintenance required. I mean, all of these sites will handle all of that for you on their end, so you don't have to worry about it. Some of the cons, just to get inlining to work, it requires internet because you need to go to one of these sites. So I know that can be a hang-up for some people sometimes. It is, though, when you're using these copy and paste sites, it is constant copying and pasting, right? If you need to make a change, you're having to go back, re-upload, your HTML, reconvert, and then it's like a back and forth process of sending a test email or testing in whatever email preview service you might be using. So it's not ideal for an iterative workflow. Other automations aren't available as a part of this, right? It's just a simple copy and paste for inlining. So if you want to add other task runner optimizations on top of it, which we'll get to in a minute, it's not included in that type of workflow. And there's no flexibility or customization. Again, since you're sort of relying on these other sites, you can't put any of your own customizations on top of it that you might want to have for your workflow. So those are just sort of the things to weigh out when you're using a third-party inliner site. The second way that you can inline your CSS is to use task runners with open source CSS inliners. And task runners, the best analogy to use for this is to really think back to sort of Henry Ford and what he did with the automobile industry. The big thing that he introduced to revolutionize how cars were built was the assembly line. And people would line up focusing on a specific task, and they would optimize the workflow based on focusing on specific tasks and nailing those down. And this is very much what is at the core of task runners. We can use task runners to automate tasks for us in a particular flow so that we don't have to do it manually ourselves. There are two key task runners at the moment that I would recommend. There's Grunt and then there's Gulp, both of which have awesome logos, by the way. But these are both JavaScript-based task runners that can be used to automate a bunch of things, namely of which is inlining CSS. The workflow that I recommend the most to email designers and developers is Lee Monroe's Grunt email workflow. This, to me, I've tested a lot of task runner workflows before. They can get pretty complex or just very hard even just to set up. This, to me, is the best workflow that's out there. It's very simple to use, it's easy to set up, and there's very little dependencies. There's not a lot of areas where you can go wrong. So I highly recommend Lee's workflow setup. And since we need an example today to show you what you can do with the task runner, we're just going to use Lee's as an example of how we could use a task runner for CSS. So here's just an example, and you can watch the video. I'm sure it's a little bit laggy, but this is sped up to show what a setup would look like for setting up a task runner type workflow. You need to use a command line tool, so whether it's terminal or whatever tool you may like, you need to use the command line to be able to set this type of stuff up. So if you aren't as technically savvy or aren't familiar as much with some of these development type environments, it may not be an ideal workflow for you. But this is what you would need to do to have it set up. I'm not going to sit through this whole video here. It would take a few minutes to set this up and go through the different items. These are the different things for Lee's workflow that you would have to do. You have to make sure you have Node installed. But then when you're in the command line, the three key things are in sort of the source code font there. The first thing you need to do is install grunt CLI and grunt. So you can do npm install grunt CLI -G. Part of his workflow, you can set up Mailgun, Litmus, and Rackspace Cloud to send test emails, send a test to Litmus, and then host your assets, your image assets if you want. That's all optional, though. I'm not going to worry about that here today. Then you need to set up the necessary packages. So you basically want to clone his repository from GitHub. So you'd have to do git clone, and then you can copy and paste that URL. And then you just need to get into the folder that it creates for you, the directory for it. So you would cd grunt-email-workflow, and then you would have to just do an npm install to make sure you have that set up. Additionally, you would have to create a secrets.json in your project root. Again, this is on that whole GitHub page that he has, and he has the code that you can copy and paste your secrets.json for. You can create it, and it can just be empty data. You don't need to fill anything for it. It's just to experience the CSS inlining part. And then finally, once you have all that set up, you can just run grunt in the command line, and then it will create a /dist folder, which will have sort of the compiled emails for you. And in this case, the only thing that we're going to be doing today with it is essentially inline emails. So here's just a quick animation of what it looks like for him when you actually run the grunt command. It's going to basically compile and build those emails on the fly for you and create an inline version. So that's essentially what it'll look like. It's just simply typing grunt once you have it all set up, and it's going to automatically create the email for you with the inline version. And we'll go through that with the live demo. Hopefully it makes a little bit more sense. But in Lee's workflow, how it works, this is just sort of the key things that it does. It's compiling Sass, so it uses Sass for the CSS, so it compiles Sass to CSS. Then it compiles handlebars, so it uses handlebars, a templating language, to HTML. So it's not quite pure HTML that you're working with. It is for the most part, but it has a handlebars language you can leverage. It inlines CSS. It actually uses Juice as an inliner, which we'll cover in a second here. And then it generates a browser preview and sends test emails if you have all that set up or care about that at all. So this uses Juice as an inliner. So the actual inliner that it uses, it's called Juice. This one is a node-based inliner. It's pretty good. I haven't run into massive issues with it, but I definitely like it. Juice is a really good inliner if you're using an open source inliner. My favorite one, though, would have to be Rody. So definitely recommend Rody. This one is a Ruby-based solution, so if you're more comfortable in Ruby, this is definitely a great solution for you, and we'll go over why I like this one a lot later on. And then there's also PreMailer. So PreMailer has sort of the user-friendly, just the site for you, but you can also just use the behind-the-scenes version of just the inliner and integrate it yourself. Historically, though, I mean, this historically has been like one of the marquee CSS inliners for HTML email. It hasn't been updated too much, although there has been recent activity around updating it and creating a new version. So stay up to date on PreMailer. Maybe there will be some really nice updates that come with it. So some of the pros and cons to think about with task runners and open source inliner. So it's nice because you can use with any editor, again, so whatever editor you use are already familiar with that fits right into your workflow. You can use locally. So this is nice because you don't need internet, and it's great to integrate with other services that you might already be using. So things like GitHub or Dropbox, if you're creating backups, having it locally on your machine, there's a lot of pros to that. It's great for complete flexibility and customization. You can do whatever you want with your workflow. You can fine-tune it as much as you want, which is really nice, and you can add other automations on top of it. Like we just mentioned, you can send tests to Litmus, you can upload your images to an external CDN. I mean, there's so many things that you can do to just build right into your workflow, which makes this a really attractive solution. And then dry, you're not repeating yourself at all. It's simply updating whenever you save and run the grunt command, which is really nice. The cons to this, there is a bit of a learning curve if you aren't familiar with any of the things I just talked about. So it does require command line and a little bit of JavaScript knowledge to be able to customize the JavaScript files is definitely helpful. So there is a little bit of a learning curve there. The thing that I don't like about a lot of the task runner workflows that you see is that there's just a lot of dependencies on the different types of requirements you need installed to run everything. And you can really run into issues if something ever comes out of date or if something just happens to break and it needs an update on the open source side, and then it just sort of puts a halt to your workflow. So I definitely encourage you, if you do try to use something like this, try to use something with very few dependencies, requires little requirements, and it's nothing crazy. Something that's very streamlined, especially if you're just trying to focus on a couple of core things like inlining CSS. And a part of that, what I mentioned, it's the maintenance is on you. There's nobody that's helping you necessarily. The open source community is, but everything is local to yourself, so you're not being able to duplicate this across teammates. Everybody would have to install separately, so it requires maintenance on your side to have everything set up and to keep everything up to date. And then the third one that is relatively new to this year, CSS Inlining and Litmus Builder, which is a little bit of a unique hybrid of both scenarios we just talked about here. So the nice thing about it is that if you use Litmus Builder as an editor right inside Litmus, it's just a simple toggle. You can go to the settings of Litmus Builder and just toggle for inlining CSS to be on, and then CSS will then be inline for the browser preview that you see and then all the instant previews that you run. So it'll automatically compile that for you, which is really nice, and we'll go over that so that you can actually see it beyond just an animated GIF here. And then it's also just a simple click and copy or download the compiled HTML. So it's a bit of a hybrid, right? You get an editor experience with it, but it is just a simple toggle. And it's, to me, it's really nice. I mean, it's what I use, and the experience is really, really nice. So when you look at just sort of the pros and cons of CSS Inlining and Litmus Builder, there's no learning curve or setup needed. You really get the power of the task runner workflow that I just talked about, but that's already set up for you out of the box. You don't even have to worry about it. You just click on the toggle and you go. There's no maintenance required at all. Litmus will basically take care of all the updates that happens on their end. It's the actual best inliner ever made for HTML email, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I really put my stamp of approval behind it, that it's besides the workflow component in terms of just the actual CSS inliner, it's the best one that's ever been made. It has the Litmus Instant Previews integration, so again, it has other tasks that it does for you automatically, and you're not repeating yourself all the time. Everything's built right into that workflow. The cons, it requires an internet access because you're using Litmus Online. There is no flexibility or customization, so again, if you're really looking for something that to customize your workflow, being able to just set up your own task runners and doing it that way is probably the best bet for you. So you give up a little bit of flexibility or customization here. It doesn't work in any other editor. You have to use Builder because it's a Builder-specific workflow here. And it's only inlines embedded CSS or CSS that's inside Builder. It's not going to inline anything that points to external style sheets. So those are sort of the things to think about for those different things. And we're going to, as soon as I'm just sort of going through the slides here, I'll walk through briefly every single one of those options so that you can see firsthand what it might look like. But before we do that, just the last thing I want to be able to go over is talk about which CSS inliner is best. So like I had mentioned, we had just talked about all of the workflows, but then it also comes down to how good is the actual inliner. That's a very big part that you need to consider, is not just does this workflow make sense, but is this inliner going to get the job done for HTML email? Because the thing about inliners is that most of them were not built specifically for HTML email. A lot of them were built by developers who are more familiar with web development and did not take into account email rendering, right? All of the different quirks for email clients and whatnot, they didn't take those into account. They were just simply thinking about, okay, we're going to take this CSS and just put it in line and not think about all of the other things that might be going on for HTML email development. Julie, she runs the email development newsletter. She actually had a great newsletter all about CSS inliners, and I really love some of these things that she pointed out, sort of about the dangers of CSS inlining. And you know, it runs the risk of changing your code to where it could break your email, right? You know, it could do things like it could remove Outlook conditional comments. It could change sort of your casing on the CSS properties that you might have used specifically for an email hack in certain clients. It might combine multiple CSS properties into shorthand and break layouts because, you know, certain examples like she shows here of Outlook, you might want multiple background declarations. So inliners, if they don't understand the context of email, can really run the risk of actually breaking a lot of what you're trying to do. And that is just a key thing to be aware of when you're selecting a specific CSS inliner. Julie recommends Rhody as the best CSS inliner for HTML email. She has a little chart breakdown here of the other types that she used. And again, there's a ton of open source CSS inliners. These are some of the popular ones. And I would actually agree with that, that I believe Rody is the best open source inliner out there. If I were using a custom workflow like this, I would use Rody myself. I really, really like Rody. It really takes into account some of the email knowledge, and I would definitely check it out if that's a route that you're considering going down. Mosaic.io wrote a blog post actually breaking down the perfect email CSS inliner, and it was great. They had a full support chart here of what every CSS inliner does, and it was a really fascinating blog post to read. So when you get the slides after, or you could just Google it, I guess, right now, but it was really, really great. And they actually ranked Litmus Builder / PutsMail. They both use the same inliner as the #1 CSS inliner for HTML email. I tend to agree. Granted, I'm biased, but I actually worked directly on that inliner, and we really made optimizations that a lot of these other inliners don't do for HTML email. And I'd like to go over what some of those items are. So when you're using CSS inlining in Litmus Builder or PutsMail, which use the same inliner, it never reorders or converts CSS in any way, which is a common fear with regular inliners. It preserves media queries, web fonts, and animations. So if you're using any specific type of CSS, it's not going to strip that out that you want to stay in the head of the document. It'll preserve Outlook conditional comments for you, so you don't have to worry about that breaking anything that you're doing specifically for Outlook. It preserves pseudo selectors. It preserves character entities, which is a big one. For uninline CSS or unlined CSS, it preserves CSS comments, so sometimes that's used as a hack for certain email clients. It preserves duplicate properties, again, going over that issue we just talked about with Outlook, how it may not support every type of background CSS. I love this, and Rody has this too, which is why I like Rody a lot. But both Rody and Litmus Builder Inliner, it has a data attribute to prevent CSS from being inline. So if you wanted to create your own style block that is prevented from being inline, you can just use the data-ignore-inlining attribute, and the CSS contained in that style block won't be inline. And I'll go over that in a minute here. But I love that because it gives you sort of complete customization and control over what you don't want to be inlined, and then separating that from what you actually do want to be inlined. Again, it has the Litmus previews integration, so it automatically inlines and then runs that on test for you, and you're not repeating yourself, as talked about. So if I had to recommend it, just based on my experience, because I've worked with every single one of these inliners, just sort of the top inliners for HTML email, I'd recommend using Litmus first for Litmus Builder or PutsMail, and then getting into the open source inliners, Rody and then Juice would be the top two that I think about. So these are the ones that I recommend the most. And I would just point out that these aren't accounting for sort of an ESP-specific use case. This is really just talking about straight-up HTML. I mean, sometimes you have ESP-specific templating language or HTML or CSS that may not be accounted or reflected for here. But this is just for regular straight-up HTML, not accounting for any of the unique ESP stuff you might be doing. This to me are what the best ones are and how I would rank them. All right, so I want to take this time now just to go over a quick demo for each of the different workflows that we talked about, so that you can just see firsthand what they are and get yourself familiar with it, so you can start to evaluate what might actually be the best one for you. So here we have an example. This is just a template from Zerb Inc. This is a common one that a lot of people use. We have the email file here on the left-hand side, and this email is actually not inlined at all. So what we're going to want to do is actually take the code of this email. So I'm just going to copy and paste this code. And the first step, or the first example of a workflow, is to show you what it would look like through a copy or paste inliner site. So here we have Litmus PutsMail as an inliner. We would simply copy and paste the code here and then input it into that HTML and click on the inline CSS button, and then it is going to automatically come and inline the CSS for us. So we can simply copy that code if we wanted to and then overwrite it in this file, and you can just come here to see that the CSS has then gone from everything being in the head, or the key things from being in the head, to then being inlined. And you can see the only things that remain in the head are the things that you want to stay in the head. Things like pseudo selectors, or external class, which is an Outlook.com or old Outlook.com hack, or anything that's in media queries. None of that's being inlined. It's just the core things that should be inlined, which is really nice. So that's just an example of a copy-paste inliner site. You're just taking your code, copying and pasting it here, and getting the result. But again, if we had to then go back and we like ran it through testing, we would have to go back, make a change, recopy it here, regenerate it. It's just a lot of back and forth, and it's still repeating yourself. But if you aren't as technical or anything, it's a really great way to get started with it. The second is Lee Monroe's grunt email design workflow, which again, the full details are here on his GitHub page for the workflow. It's very straightforward. I would just follow it. It outlines it really well. We're going to skip the setup. I already have the setup, so I just want to show you what it might look like in the terminal here. So I already have this set up, and again, as I showed you in the slides, all you need to do is just type grunt once you're ready, and then it's going to come through and run these automations for you. And so it's essentially going to output our inline version in the dist folder. So we have the example of the email here. This is what the email looks like. And if we were to just come over to the editor, I have it open. This is what, again, it uses handlebars as a templating language. So this is sort of what a wrapper is of every email. And then you can see it in this body is where it's going to be injecting sort of the unique email. So the branded.hbs is what we have for this actual email here. So you can see that right here. This is what the content is. And then if I open up the folder that runs with it here, this is where everything lives. The dist folder is where it outputs everything into an HTML, but the source is where everything lives. So the source of the CSS file, the emails, which is their handlebars, the layouts and partials. It has a whole bunch of things built in. It's a really nice workflow if you get to know it. But once you have everything done, you just type in grunt, and then it's going to output this for you in its own separate folder. And if I open this up here in Atom, you can see that it's going to come through and then automatically have all of that inline for us. It runs that for us, all by simply typing out and running the grunt command, which is real nice, real easy, and it gives you sort of an overview of everything that it did. Another cool thing about his workflow, just to show you, because you can see it update live, is that it also has a grunt serve functionality, and what this does is it will actually open up sort of a live preview in the browser for you. So we can select the template that we were working on, the branded.html. You get a preview of everything that's happening in the email here and a mobile view as well, which is pretty cool. So we can come right in here. Let's just make the simple change here. Just make it say example. We can save it, and then if we were to come back through and you wanted to rerun everything, you could, but it'll automatically update it for you locally as well, which is pretty nice. So again, it's just getting familiar with command line a little bit, making sure you have everything set up, and then you can run these simple commands. It's just simply grunt and grunt serve if you want this live preview for his workflow, and it's creating that inline version automatically. So that's really nice as well. Hopefully that makes it feel a little bit more inviting. Again, everything's right in the GitHub workflow, which is really good at outlining everything that's going on there. And then finally, Litmus Builder. So if we open up Litmus here, and I'm just going to full screen this now at this point since we don't need the other editor. You can come into Litmus when you're in Builder, litmus.com/builder. Let's say we want to create a new project, create a CSS Inlining webinar. We'll use Ink, which is one of the templates we have by default. We'll load this up here. It's going to create our project with that template. So you can see our code will be on the left-hand side here, and then the live preview of what's going on in the email will be happening right here. if we go to File, Settings, all we need to do is make sure that we toggle Inline CSS to be on so that it has a green check mark to it. We save those settings, and now it's going to automatically inline the CSS for us. Now, since this is a browser-based editor, it doesn't really matter for the browser preview because it supports CSS anyways. But if we were to come here to Instant Previews and generate a test, you'll see that it runs the inline CSS, the compiled version for all the different email clients. And if we come down here to Gmail, you'll be able to see that Gmail is playing nice with us because it's showing the inline version. So this workflow is nice because you get to manage sort of the source uninline version here on the left, and it's basically running that test and compiling it for you to see the previews, and you don't have to worry about using the end compiled result. You can just sort of test as you're going along and make edits or changes to the original if you want to. What's really cool is that you can also send a test email to yourself. The same functionality that PutsMail has is built right into Builder, and this will send the inline version as well. So you could just send an email to kevin@litmus.com if you wanted and sort of get a test email in your local inbox. And then once you're done with all of this, what's really nice is that you can just come down to the drop down to it's the HTML, CSS, but then there's a view compiled. You come here, and it's just a simple little modal where you can click to copy that inline CSS, or you can download and use the -compile.html file. So it's real nice. Everything's just really built into the workflow. This is what I use for inlining, and it's nice because everything's just built right out of the box, and it's just a simple toggle, and you're good to go. To me, it's like a nice middle ground between you don't need this crazy complex setup, but it's a little bit more than just a copy and paste inliner site can give you. So if I just come back to my slides here now, just to wrap things up. So just some tools and resources to go over. Litmus.com/community. So we have a Litmus community. It's basically an amazing forum to answer any question that you have around email design, development, or marketing. So if you ever have a question about CSS inlining or any of these workflows that we talked about, you can come post a question here, and you'll get an expert answering it for you, which is really nice. And it's completely free. You don't need a Litmus. You just need to create like a Litmus account, but it's totally free to post questions and get answers. It's really, really helpful. I use it myself to answer any questions I may have from time to time. Litmus Scope. I love Litmus Scope. Litmus.com/scope. You can basically grab the source code of any HTML email that you see. This works in Gmail. So if you're using Gmail, you can basically grab the source code. So anytime you see a cool email, you should be able to just grab the source code using Scope, and it's a nice shareable version of that email. You don't have to rely on the web version all the time. Litmus Builder, which we just talked about, you can go to litmusbuilder.com. I guess one thing I didn't mention, you can use the CSS inlining part of Litmus Builder. It's totally free. So it's a free account that you can sign up for, and you can use it just for inlining if you want. The previews are a premium version, but you can just, if you just wanted to use it for the inlining, that's totally free. And then again, litmus.com, we specialize in the preview, so you can see what your email looks like in over 50 different email clients, everything from Outlook to Gmail to iOS, over 50 different email clients. It's really, really nice. And one of the things I just want to point out too before we get to questions, I'm doing another webinar on how to automate your email development workflow with Litmus Builder. We don't have a sign-up link or anything ready just yet, but you can put it on your calendar. It's going down on Wednesday, September 7th at 1 p.m. And I'm basically going to show you how you can use Litmus Builder to automate a ton of your workflow beyond just CSS inlining. So we'll go over how to do a lot of those customizations that I talked about using a task runner workflow, and how we've had a lot of task runners built into Litmus Builder and sort of using that to better organize and manage your emails, but also just cut your production time in half, right? That's what the whole key of this, these types of workflows are, is to not repeat yourself and cut down on the manual work so that you can have more time actually designing the email instead of focusing on building it or troubleshooting or focusing on rendering. It's about speeding up the workflow. So yeah, I'm going to answer questions now at this point. I just want to let everybody know there's a 7-day free trial of Litmus. You can just use the coupon code CSS Inlining if you go to litmus.com/giftcard. And that'll give you access to over 50 different email clients to preview. You'll get access to analytics. It's really, really great. So especially for the CSS Inlining workflow we talked about today, make sure you go to litmus.com/giftcard, input the coupon code CSS Inlining, and you get that nice iterative workflow experience right inside Builder that we showed. So, Lauren, what questions do we have from the audience today?
We have a lot of questions today, so we can try to get through as many as possible, and we'll put the rest of them in a follow-up blog post. To start, we had 2 questions on templates. The first is which, if they're working with pre-built templates and they have code that they can modify, some clients you mentioned don't support style sheets. Is that why if someone's altering the code and they test it, it looks different between clients?
Well, it could be. I mean, obviously it will vary from use case, but if you have end users who are editing a template and maybe have a different workflow than what you have set up with CSS inlining or not inlining, that could be a cause for discrepancy between what you see. And that's definitely a consideration to have, obviously, when you're setting up your workflow or using templates or using something like this. What are the end users going to be of this workflow? So you want to make sure that if this is something that needs to be extended across teammates or across clients, that you have the same workflow set up between you, or that they at least have the end result captured and are only editing the end result. So those are just some of the gotchas you need to look out for when you're using a workflow like this.
Awesome. And the other question about templates is, do templates that you're using typically have inline CSS, and how would you figure out if they do?
Sure. So templates vary. Some come with inline CSS, some don't. The one example I used today was a template from Zerb Inc., and that template was not inlined at all. It's very easy to distinguish the difference, though. I mean, if there's no CSS that's inline in the body in the HTML, and there's no style HTML attribute with all of that inline styling, it's not an inline version. If all this CSS styling is in the head of the document, it's not inlined. And everything, you'll notice if it's an inline template, because it will be a bit, I like to use the word, I guess I shouldn't say bloated, but a little bit more heavy on the code side, and it has a lot of that inline style, the style HTML attribute with all of the CSS properties on all of the different elements, every element from tables to paragraph tags to heading tags to image tags to link tags. I mean, you'll see the styling everywhere. If it's being run through an inliner, it will have that. So that's sort of what you should look out for to distinguish between if a template has been inlined or not.
A question about PutsMail. Will it work with other email service providers, or does it only work with Litmus Builder?
So PutsMail, similarly to other inliner sites, they don't have a direct integration into an ESP. I mean, PutsMail has the functionality to send a test email to whatever email address you want, unlike a lot of the other just pure inliner sites. There isn't anything special out of the box for an integration with an ESP. So I guess the short answer is no, but neither do any of the other third-party inliner sites. They're simply meant as simple tools to copy and paste your HTML email to get inlined. And yeah, I guess I would say I know, at least from our end, there isn't anything crazy specific for the PutsMail or Builder inliner to account for ESP-specific code. We're always updating and trying to get any fixes that it needs. So if you ever have an issue, feel free to just email our support, hello@litmus.com, and we're happy to update it to avoid any rendering issues. But it doesn't do anything crazy out of the box to account for anything like that.
There were a few questions about grunt. Is it for Mac only?
No, so any task runner, it's a JavaScript-based task runner for the examples that I showed today. That's independent of what OS you're working on. Now, depending on what types of software you might want to use for command line or your editors or whatnot, obviously those can be operating system specific, but task runners in of themselves are just JavaScript, and it's available to use on any type of platform. So yeah, it's not about being specific to a particular operating system in that sense. It's I guess maybe the type of software that you use to run the editors or the command line or whatnot, but everything's available no matter what platform you're on for this type of workflow. That's not an issue at all.
Do you have any step-by-step guides on using grunt that you recommend?
That's a really good question. I did actually write an article in Net Magazine a while ago about it, although that might be a little bit outdated. Lee Monroe, whose workflow I showed today, had a talk that he did with his specific workflow, and basically a task runner talk from the email design conference in last year, so 2015. I know he talked about that. That was a great talk. I'm coming up blank in terms of actual walkthroughs, especially in the context of email. Your best bet is to really just explore some of these that are on GitHub, and those probably have the best directions and instructions about how to implement them. But a lot of it too that you'll find isn't necessarily in the context of email. So just make sure when you're looking out some of these task runners. I mean, task runners are independent of email or the web. They're just sort of a way to automate tasks, but definitely make sure as you're evaluating these different workflows, try to find ones that are in the context of email. It'll probably be a bit more helpful for, the considerations it's taking. But yeah, I would definitely, I'll try to do some more research and post any links or guides in a follow-up that we do, but definitely search GitHub and explore the different types of sort of task runners for HTML email out there and what types of workflows there are. Those probably have the best instructions.
Awesome. And like Kevin just said, we will be doing a recap blog post, which will have some of the questions on here, so we can include all of the links and things like that he referenced as well. Another question, Kevin, we had a few angry questions and people tweeting about Gmail and their lack of support for embedded CSS. Is there any insights on why Gmail doesn't support this? Do they have any plan to support embedded CSS and media queries? Is there any movement towards that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I think that we all wish we knew the answer to. So I think from a larger, I'll answer it this way, and again, I am not somebody from Gmail, so don't take my word on all of this, but if you look at all of the webmails, they don't support external style sheets, and then Gmail is the one that sort of processes out embedded CSS, which is disappointing. Even if, Gmail is the core reason we need to use inline styles. If Gmail supported just embedded CSS, we could move on from using inline styles, tomorrow for the most part. The issue, I think, and again, I'm not a representative of Gmail, but I think the core issue lies in that they are trying to process out HTML email that could be harmful, that could be spam. Gmail has shown to be a very security-driven team when it comes to making product decisions for Gmail, and so they don't want to make it easy for developers to hack around and manipulate with email in the inbox. They view it as a very spammy type of tactic. So that's why they only support element selectors in gmail.com addresses and then strip out the style block in other clients like Google Apps, Inbox by Gmail, and the Gmail apps. I wish I had a better answer from them. There's no indication of support coming for embedded CSS or any better CSS support from them. So until we do, or until we hear any notice or magically happen to notice it change one day, they won't be supporting that in the near term, and they just view it very much so as a security issue, and they process that out so that there's nothing funky going on in the inbox for their users. So that's the best I can answer for Gmail, though, but definitely if you want to tweet them at Gmail or do what you can to make some noise, I'm sure it would help.
Team effort. There were a few questions also about inlining and media queries. How can you inline media queries that are needed for responsive emails? Why doesn't CSS Inlining make media queries inline?
Sure. So the short answer is that you should never inline media query CSS. If you're using a media query, that media query CSS needs to stay in the head of the document as a part of the embedded CSS or external style sheets if it's supported, but everything in emails largely through embedded CSS. It needs to stay in the head of the document. You should never inline media query CSS because then it would not work when you want the media query activated. So simple example, if you had a media query that had a max and you were using it for the condition with a max width of 600 pixels, if you inline the CSS that was inside that media query, as soon as it got to that max width of 600 pixels, that CSS would not be activated in the media query because it would have been stripped and inlined, and it would therefore have been rendered useless. And this is just one of the common concerns that is shared with a lot of inliners that actually don't respect media queries and just inline it right away, and it basically strips the media query. So depending on what inliner you use, the ones I recommended today don't, but that's something you need to look out for that a lot of inliners overlook. They just inline media queries itself, and you don't want that to happen. Media queries should always stay in the head of the document in the embedded CSS.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. We're already a minute past the hour, so I think we are out of time for questions, but we will include some in the follow-up blog post, so keep your eye on litmus.com/blog in the next coming days, and also keep a lookout on your inbox because we will be sending the recording and the slides probably early next week. Thank you for the knowledge share, Kevin.
Thanks, Lauren.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.